They say time heals everything, that memories fade and eventually you move on. But some memories aren't like that. Some stay with you, clear as glass, cutting into your mind over and over. I can't shake the sound of Cass's voice, the last look on her face before she disappeared. I can't stop seeing her silhouette at the edge of the trees. We went up to the cabin to get away from everything, our jobs, city traffic, deadlines, and the constant buzz of screens and phones. We wanted a place where we could disconnect, just the five of us, like old times. Jake and I had been talking about it since spring, and once we convinced Alex, he found the perfect spot online. Secluded mountain cabin, ideal for stargazing and hiking. The pictures made it look like a dream. There were 5 of us: me, my brother Jake, Alex, Cass, and Meg. We'd all been friends since high school, back when everything was simple. None of us were married yet or tied down by kids, so this felt like the last chance for us all to spend some real time together. Cass was probably the most excited. She loved nature, hiking, all of it. I don't think any of us expected it to be anything but a weekend to remember. In a way, I guess it was. The drive to the cabin took us further from civilization than I had anticipated. I'd been expecting a paved road with a few scenic turns, but after we left the highway, it was winding, narrow dirt paths that seemed to stretch on forever. The GPS kept losing signal, and Alex was our navigator, half burying his face in the map every 10 minutes, trying to find the right turn. "Are we sure this is the way?" Meg asked from the back seat. She'd been nervous the entire drive, watching the trees close in around us with a wary eye. Jake, my brother, shot her a reassuring smile. "Relax, Meg. What's the worst that could happen? A bear knocks on our door and asks for sugar?" Everyone laughed, but I could feel a bit of unease settling in as the road became more rugged, twisting through dense pines that blocked out the sunlight. It felt like we were leaving the world behind, like we were driving into some forgotten place. Finally, after a few wrong turns, the cabin appeared around a bend, tucked between towering trees, with its weathered wood and darkened windows staring out at us like empty eyes. It looked different from the pictures, older, lonelier. Something about it felt tired, like it had been waiting for us longer than we could know. Inside, the cabin was just as rustic as the outside promised. There was a faint smell of damp wood and dust, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old wooden floors creaked underfoot as we split up, dropping our bags in the bedrooms and exploring the space. Cass was the first to open a window, letting in the crisp, pine-scented air. "This place has charm," she said, trying to break the tension, but her voice sounded hollow against the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding, like the cabin was sizing us up. Alex found a stack of firewood near the fireplace and started stacking logs, his movements brisk and tense. Meg wrapped herself in a blanket and sat near the fire, avoiding the windows. "So, we're here," she said with a faint smile, but her eyes kept darting toward the darkened corners of the room. "It's nice to disconnect, I guess." As the night wore on, we all loosened up. Jake and I started cooking dinner, trying to keep things light, while Cass and Meg set the table and Alex put on some music. The tension faded as we laughed and joked, each of us slipping into our old roles, remembering why we were friends in the first place. But every now and then I'd catch Cass glancing toward the window, her face unreadable. I brushed it off, figuring she was just tired from the long drive. That night after dinner, we decided to take a short walk. The woods around the cabin were silent, still, as if holding their breath. There was a full moon, casting silver light through the branches, illuminating patches of ground here and there. Cass and I led the way, with the others following close behind. I remember the sound of our footsteps crunching through leaves, the way the shadows seemed to reach out for us. The path was barely visible, just a thin trail winding between the trees. At one point, Cass stopped, tilting her head to listen. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, just stood there staring into the darkness. I looked too, but saw nothing except shadows stretching deeper into the forest. Eventually she shook her head, muttering something about the wind, and we continued on. but I could see a flicker of unease in her eyes, and it stayed with me, like a splinter lodged in the back of my mind. The next morning, Cass seemed restless, pacing near the windows, glancing out toward the forest. I thought about asking her if something was bothering her, but I hesitated. She wasn't usually one to get spooked, and I didn't want to come off as overprotective. After breakfast, she announced she was going to take a walk on her own, to clear her head. We all offered to come with her, but she insisted, brushing us off with a half-hearted smile. "I'll be back soon," she promised, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. She hesitated at the door, glancing back at us one last time, before stepping out into the cool morning air. None of us thought much of it at first. Cass had always been independent, the kind of person who needed her space. But as the hours stretched on and she didn't return, a quiet worry settled over us. By noon, we were exchanging anxious glances, pacing around the cabin, checking the trail out front. "We should go look for her," Meg finally said, her voice tight. She looked around at each of us, her face pale. "She wouldn't just disappear." Jake nodded, grabbing his flashlight. "She couldn't have gone far. Maybe she just lost track of time." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. I think we all knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. We spread out, calling her name, following the narrow trails through the trees. But the forest swallowed our voices. The silence was absolute, pressing in on us from all sides. Every branch looked the same. Every path twisted into another, until I couldn't tell where we'd already been. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Cass walking back toward us, laughing at how worried we'd all been. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows, stretching on, deeper than I could fathom. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, our calls grew more frantic. Meg's voice cracked as she called Cass's name, her hands shaking. Alex and Jake exchanged worried looks, muttering under their breaths, their faces grim. Finally, as darkness fell, we stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted and empty-handed. None of us could sleep that night. We sat around the dying fire, staring at the door, hoping it would creak open, hoping she'd just walk in and tell us we'd been fools to worry. But the hours dragged on, and the cabin remained silent. By the third day, our fear had turned into something sharper, a gnawing dread that we couldn't shake. Alex had gone into town to call for help, but the nearest authorities were miles away, and they weren't optimistic. They warned us about the terrain, about the dangers of the forest, but their words only made things worse. Jake paced constantly, muttering about how she couldn't have just vanished, how it didn't make sense. Meg was quiet, withdrawn, her eyes hollow. She sat by the window, staring out into the trees as if willing Cass to appear. I barely recognized her anymore. None of us spoke much. We were too tired, too haunted by the silence, by the weight of the forest pressing in on us. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside, the soft crunch of leaves, but when I looked, there was nothing. Just shadows shifting in the moonlight, branches swaying in the breeze. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched never left. The tension was unbearable. We turned on each other, accusing, questioning, desperate for answers that none of us had. Jake insisted that Cass must have left clues, something we'd missed, while Alex suggested she'd just wanted to get away, that she'd been unhappy and had chosen to disappear. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Cass wouldn't have left us like that. She wouldn't have walked into the woods without a word. I kept replaying that last look she'd given us, the way her eyes had lingered on the cabin as if she'd seen something we hadn't. Meg started waking up in the middle of the night screaming, convinced that she'd seen Cass standing at the edge of the trees. I tried to comfort her, but the words felt empty, meaningless. We were all trapped, haunted by something we couldn't explain. On the last night as I lay awake, I thought I heard her voice. It was faint, carried on the wind, calling my name. I got up, my heart pounding, and stumbled outside, peering into the darkness. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. And then I saw it, her backpack lying just a few yards from the cabin, half hidden under a pile of leaves. My hands shook as I picked it up, running my fingers over the familiar fabric, feeling the weight of it in my arms. But there was no sign of her, no tracks, nothing that could explain where she'd gone. In that moment, I knew. She was gone, truly gone, and we would never find her. The forest had swallowed her whole, taken her somewhere I couldn't follow. It's been months now, but I still can't shake the memory of that cabin, the silence that seemed to seep into my bones. I lie awake at night, listening to the wind, waiting for the sound of her voice, wondering if she's still out there somewhere, lost in the darkness. People tell me to move on, to let her go, but I can't. I keep seeing her in my dreams, standing just out of reach, her eyes fixed on me with that same look of quiet understanding, as if she's waiting for me to join her. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wonder if I ever really left that cabin at all.